I was raised to study the sciences. Initially, I had actually hoped to go to India, right? But India, this was the time of Babri Masjid, and they had just demolished Babri Masjid, and I really didn't want to go to a country in which Muslims were in a minority, fine, but in such a vulnerable situation. When I came back to study Bangladesh, it was the time of the caretaker government, and when I told my relatives that, these are the sorts of things that I studied and I want to study here, they literally just refused to engage with me. The rivers actually produce land all the time. The land is always coming up.
Earlier you were saying about how the expressions regarding Khaja Khijir, how it has evolved in.
One of the things that I noticed over the course of doing field work is that when you talk to women, they don't remember Khijir, right? But they will talk about all these ghostly things.
In all the mosques of Pakistan, they would have to register them into a certain school of thought also. They would have to declare that I am from Berlvi or I am from Deobandi community.
I would never universalize women.
So what's about that aha moment?
One of the ways in which an anthropologist can tell is when they can get a joke, right? And another moment that they can tell that they really fit in is when they can tell a joke.
How you have gone through the training process?
We don't teach methods before people go to do the field. Bangladeshis are actually by nature quite observant, right? It's something that I didn't see in the context of Pakistan. In the context of Pakistan, I found people were kind of blind to the environment.
Welcome to Fine Line Podcast. In Fine Line Podcast, we talk about economics, politics, policies and beyond this from both Bangladeshi and global perspective. I'm Raghi Banju. In today's podcast, we have Professor Dr. Naveeda Khan with us, anthropologist from Johns Hopkins University. How are you, ma'am?
I'm fine, thank you. And how are you, Raghi?
Yeah, ma'am, I'm feeling well. Thank you so much for joining in this early. So, ma'am, how's overall your observation? Just we have seen a political shift in Bangladesh. The youth is pretty excited, and I have seen that you are closely observing all the changes. So what's your perspective on it?
Thank you, Raghi, for having me here on this show. I really appreciate it, and this opportunity to speak about my work and my observations about what's going on in Bangladesh. As you rightly point out, I was here in Bangladesh during the July Uprising in August 2024, and I observed people on the streets very passionately feeling that they needed a change in their situation, in their political, economic, and life circumstances. And I found that to be very powerful, and I decided to make some comments at the time. And those were more the comments of the moment without really fully understanding what was going on in the wider context. So I felt that I needed to come back and actually make sure that my perspectives and the perspectives on youth participation, women's participation, the participation of common people in the July Uprising be deepened. And so when I came back 6 months later, I decided to get together with Shobona Dipti, who graduated from Dhaka University and who's been an activist for a long time, and at the time was teaching at ULAB, I believe, as an anthropologist. And I also got together with Barish Chaudhary, who is an environmental lawyer at Bela. And the three of us decided to do some more writings which were public facing, looking at the involvement of university. What did it mean for the university to be a place of such kind of politics? And since that time, I have decided to write a short book on the July Uprising. And really, when I say short, it's going to be short. And the idea is to really study the year of the revolution.
2024.
2024 to examine all the sorts of events that have happened over that time, the ways in which hope has gone up and down, and all sorts of realities have also come in, pragmatism, etc. So that is the crux of what I'm working on right now.
So, ma'am, it would be an observation from your side regarding pre-July, July, and post-July.
Yes, and it'll really cover very tightly that frame, because there have been lots of other repercussions of that shift in power, questions about constitutional change, questions about youth participation in politics, such as NCP, questions about elections, etc. That's a little bit outside of the frame. Right? So it's a little bit looking at that event, trying to really sort of capture the day-to-day in some ways of what happens.
So more of a focusing on day-to-day expressions, and also focusing on like how university as a public sphere got involved into it.
Yes, absolutely. And the reason for this is because when a revolution happens or an uprising happens, there's such quick change, right, that you kind of forget what happens in the right aftermath of a revolution. It's a time of a lot of uncertainty and chaos.
Yep.
And how institutions absorb it, how they respond, how people absorb it and respond, how the government responds. This is very important information, and it's information that other people in other parts of the world, I think, will benefit from. Whereas if we start to really just think about what does this mean in terms of the larger political structure of the country, or the future of the country, then we kind of lose the focus on what happens when there's a power vacuum, right? And it says something about the people to see how they come together or they fail to come together. And so that's why my frame is really just tightly around that year.
Ma'am, till now we have seen that you, in this podcast, you have focused on deepening the perspective and also capturing the moment. So yeah, that's what an anthropologist do. So like, I would more like to know about your journey, like how you have grown your interest in studying anthropology, and how overall your journey of like, first of all starting the Islam of Pakistan, then moving into studying the chores of Bangladesh, and then this study of studying the July. So like, how was the whole journey? Like, what's your reflection on it? Yeah.
Thank you so much. That's a lovely question. But actually, of course, like a lot of good Bangladeshis, I was raised to study the sciences, and I showed some skill in mathematics and in physics. And so my parents had this big wish that I would study physics. And really, in truth, that is what I went to study abroad. But as it turns out, I realized that I was a little bit more mediocre in mathematics than my parents had led me to believe, and that actually I was really quite good at the social sciences. And so I made the shift to studying history, and I think my parents have never forgiven me for that. However, history, much as I loved history, I realized that I actually like talking with people a lot more, and history does mean that you have to go look at archives, old texts, old papers. And so I decided to change to anthropology for my master's, and then eventually for my PhD, cultural anthropology. And it's basically the way that I sort of figured out what it is that I wanted to study is, all the things that were difficult for me. The things that came easily to me, I felt like, it wasn't very much fun to just do that. But to pursue something that was like difficult for me to wrap my head around was what was more of an intellectual challenge. And being from Bangladesh, Pakistan is a particular kind of difficulty, right? Growing up, hearing about 71 and hearing about even the years leading to 71 has meant that, we have, as Bangladeshis, very strong feelings about Pakistan, the Pakistan of the past, right? And so I thought, why not go to a place which I would actually be normally not be inclined towards, and to see if I can study this not objectively, but with some kind of openness, right? And so that's what led me to go to Pakistan. Initially, I had actually hoped to go to India, right? But India, this was the time of Babri Masjid, and they had just demolished Babri Masjid, and I really didn't want to go to a country in which Muslims were in a minority, fine, but in such a vulnerable situation. So I thought, okay, this is interesting. Why not I go to Pakistan, where at least in terms of its own discourse about itself, its self-representation, Pakistan really does think of itself as a homeland for Muslims. And what does it mean to be in a Muslim majority country that thinks of itself actively as Muslim? And so that's why I went and studied Pakistan. And then eventually a time came when my parents were aging and I wanted to come back to study in Bangladesh. And so I returned here. But interestingly, the topic that I had chosen to work on in Pakistan, which was really to look at the politics of mosque construction in urban spaces, specifically Lahore, was not something that was as easily translatable here. When I came back to study Bangladesh, it was the time of the caretaker government. So there was a lot of sensitivity around religion in general. And when I told my relatives that, these are the sorts of things that I studied and I want to study here, they literally just refused to engage with me. They just felt so uncomfortable with me asking questions like, what are the differences among Muslims here? Do they fight over mosques like they did in the context of Lahore? What does this mean in terms of Muslim identity? What does it mean in terms of state protection and so on? And they were very uncomfortable. So I decided I had to, study something else, shift a little bit, but I didn't know what, right? I knew that if it was something about Bangladesh, it had to be something about water, right? Because water is such an integral part of Bangladeshi self-identity. And it was also the time when I was looking that COP was going on, climate negotiations were going on in Bali. And so it was in the news all the time and everybody was talking about it. And so as a result, I thought I'll work on something to do with water. And so I went to the south, the southern Bangladesh, and I looked at coastal context there. And I also went to the north and went to, places like Shirajganj and Tangail and Bogora, etc. And I realized that I was much more interested in the Brahmaputra than I was in the coastal areas. At that time, the coastal area was already also being studied by several very excellent anthropologists. And I thought, well, it would be nice to work in a different part of Bangladesh where, has also been perhaps understudied, right? With context of climate change, right? Because when we think about climate change, we generally, all coastal areas, we don't think about upland as much, right? So I thought, okay, this will be a different perspective on climate change. So that's what took me to the north. But I became fascinated in chores because trying to cross that Aricha Ghat when I was a child, it used to be a big water body, right? But when I went with my father to actually, to go to his village in Manikganj, I realized that chore had come up, and now there was just these tiny, pathways to cross, right? And that was the first, I think, understanding I had. I'm such a city-born Bangladeshi that, the rivers actually produce land all the time. The land is always coming up, right, inside the country. So that means that the territory is constantly changing its contours, right? And so that's when I got really fascinated in chores. Like I knew I wanted to study the north, and then I became interested in the chores in the Brahmaputra Jamuna River. And so that took me there, and I studied that, and I'm still studying it. I'm still trying to finish a second book on the chores. The first one was really looking at what does it mean to live with moving land, and the second one is looking at how do we understand climate change within this context, right? Because I needed a long period of time to be able to see climate change as a part of people's lives, right? And so, so I'm still working on that. But as I mentioned, I was here during July, August of last year, and this was so dramatic. And I've never lived through anything like this in my life. So I thought I should also spend a little bit of time thinking about that.
So yeah, ma'am, quite an interesting story. So ma'am, focusing on we have seen that you have developed your research interest firstly on Islam, then Brahmaputra. Like, were you sure that you will be studying Islam? Was that always in back of your mind when taking the masters and like studying? Like, were you sure regarding it?
Well, I believe so. I mean, anthropology is a very open discipline. You write something as in order to get into your doctoral program, but then as you go out into the field and people are not interested in answering the questions you have for them, but they want you to hear about something else, then you know your questions change. It's a very dynamic process. However, I knew early on that I wanted to work on Islam, in part because I got my education in the New School of Social Research. That's what it was called at the time. Now, since then, it's become just the New School. And Talal Asad was teaching there, and he was a huge influence. And I really I learned so much from him.
So you directly took some classes from him?
Yes, he oversaw my masters. Yes.
Wow.
So as a result, I was, as a result of his work, I was very interested, especially the genealogy of religion. The formations of the secular hadn't come out as yet. And the genealogy of religion showed that, to go out and study something like religion was a very secular kind of a move, right? And so to try and understand how it is that something gets cordoned off and bound as religion was really what his intervention was, and to really pay attention to the sort of shifting terrain of authority and practice, the way that these two are bound together within religion. And so I wanted to study how something like Islam was bound in the context of Pakistan, right? How it is that the state propagation of a certain kind of Islam made it into an ideology, right? But how it is that when people practiced it, they practiced it not as an ideology. They practiced it in everyday life, not thinking of it as practicing Islam, right? But much more intuitively, much more bodily, etc. So I wanted to look at the juxtaposition of the two. And as I said, I had initially intended to do that in India, but then because of the historical events of the time, I pivoted to Pakistan. I could have studied it in Bangladesh, but because I was from Bangladesh, and I had this little bit of a romance that an anthropologist goes somewhere else to study, right? I wanted to learn the language and go somewhere else, and so that's what I did.
So ma'am, coming on to another question from it, that like whether a anthropologist who is a foreign like visitor or foreign scholar, does it give any extra bit of benefit to that visitor or that anthropologist when he is studying foreign culture? Like, what's the difference between studying the foreign culture and the local culture? Like, you have gone through both. You have studied the chores and also the Islam of Pakistan. So what was the experiential differences?
Okay, yeah, that's a great question. So in the context of Pakistan, I will say that I took full advantage of the fact that I was from Bangladesh to try and make clear to people that I was not from there, right? Both because of my own upbringing, because I felt that, I wanted to be clear about being a Bangladeshi there, but also because I didn't want to be assimilated into the local political structure, the socioeconomic class and the sort of like, the way in which we classify one another in any given society. We meet somebody, we start to immediately say, kar chele, kar me, বাসা কোথায়, গ্রাম কোথায়, এটা ওটা, right? So I wanted to do something a bit different when I was in Pakistan. And in Pakistan, the fact that I was from Bangladesh meant that people were overjoyed to meet me, right? People would be difficult, and then I would say, Ami Bangladeshi, you know, I would say it in Urdu, Main Bangladesh se hu. And then in 2 seconds, it was like a game changer, right? People would be like, how can I help you? What would you like to see? You know? And so I really felt like I got a lot of support that way. And that led me to think that actually being from outside, being a foreigner to a place, might bring about the kind of hospitality that's already there within a particular society that may have eroded a bit in relationship to one another, right? In the context of Bangladesh, the chore was foreign land for me. I was someone from outside, right? And I wasn't quickly assimilated to Dhaka and to, you know, any kind of socioeconomic status here, etc. Rather, in the chore context, right? If you were outside of that shamaj, you were bideshi. Right, so anything that was just outside of what was the local parameters was considered bidesh, but it didn't carry any judgment. It just meant from outside.
You are not from our culture.
Yes, not culture, but you're not from our shamaj, right? Our network, right? And so as a result, because this is a chore elaka, and because land breaks and people have to move all the time, they're constantly being assimilated into one another's shamaj. Right, so there was a kind of a flexibility to this whole shamaj character within chores, right? And so I was kind of assimilated into not a shamaj but into the village, right? It was, as they said, Baro Mishali village, right? It meant that so many different people had come from so many different sides that they had become like lots of different shag together, you know.
So ma'am, regarding studying like both chores and Pakistan, you have said that you got some sort of an advantage for being a foreign people or like foreign observer. So when studying July, was that advantage still present? Were you getting that advantage of being a person from outside just studying July, or like in this time it was quite a bit tough?
Yeah, it was different. It wasn't tough because the thing about anthropology is that there's no such thing as a wrong entry point, right? Every entry point is a valid entry point. For example, if you're seeing a big meeting, right, there are anthropologists who know people right on the stage, right?
Okay.
And so they have a certain perspective, right? Then there are anthropologists who know people who have invites, so they're in the program, right? Then there are anthropologists who are sitting outside drinking tea at the local tea shop, talking about what's going on over there, right? And that's also an entry point. Right? So there's no such thing as a bad entry point within anthropology or a good, better entry point. So for me, when I pivoted to working on July, yes, I was in this context, right? And I was, you know, I had strong opinions about right and wrong and good and bad, etc. But it wasn't as though I needed to know the people who were at the heart of things, right? I just needed to just be taking a rickshaw or a CNG during the Obutton, right? And just be talking to people, right? Every single person who spoke to me became somebody who was telling me something, right? And so I just really decided that I would not take advantage of any kind of the fact that I went to a particular school or I know certain people, etc., to get to know what happened. That I would just build up from the 1 to 2 people I met, and then further on like that.
So it was sort of a snowballing sort of like
snowballing, and it was transversal. It wasn't like trying to go to the top. Right? It was just trying to see how far I can go where. And when I felt a dhakka or resistance, that was interesting. I didn't try to like say, oh no, I must get around it. Right?
So you were just shaping the map, like what was the horizontal?
Yes, so just like saying, কত দূর যেতে পারি, কাকে জিজ্ঞাসা করতে পারি, কি জানতে পারি, you know. So that's the way I've been doing it.
So it was very much exploratory.
Very exploratory. In fact, fact, as I mentioned, I've come back several times over the past year to take the pulse, right? Every time I found a dramatically different situation. Every time the chapters of the book has looked different, right? So, because, and I've tried very hard not to have the present dictate the chapters because of what I said earlier, because the present will rewrite that event, right? And so trying to also...
So you are trying to capture the moment always.
The moment, right? And to also see how the moment is being shaped in people's memories as they're moving forward. So it's a two-leveled thing, so...
Ma'am, you are saying that the socio-economic status of the people who is observing or who is studying the culture actually shapes the information the mass people will be giving to that visitor or that scholar. So while studying in Pakistan, you look certain way or like you speak certain way. So didn't that shape the perspective of the mass people towards you? Like you might be coming from a certain class, or like the identity of coming from outside Pakistan, coming from Bangladesh was enough to like just move that away?
The question of socioeconomic class is incredibly important because in the context of Bangladesh, for example, what class you come from really sort of determines your reception, right, by wider society. It's a very class-based society. And in Pakistan, it's class, but there's also caste. There's caste here too, but it's more subtle. The caste in Pakistan is biradari. Right? It's not the caste of India. It's a different formation.
हमारे बिरादरी से नहीं है माने.
Yes.
There's
right? So there are lots of different biradaris. You have that a little bit, Jat here, and also, people will say that they are from particular groups, right? So there are other kinds of affiliations. It's not just class. So, but class is definitely one of the important ones. What I find for an anthropologist, most anthropologists will be from a different status from the people they study, simply because they can move. The people who they study can't always move with the same fluidity, right? They can come and go as they want, right? So just that freedom of movement means that you are from a particular socioeconomic structure, right? But what I have found, and what other anthropologists have also found, is that coming back is always very important, right? If you go someplace and you just leave, you take your information and you leave, then that says something, right? But if you come back, people understand you very differently, right? It's very important to keep returning, right? And also staying with a question, right? Not thinking that what you heard the first time is really, it's not like it was a fake question, but that there are many layers to that question. So for example, when I first went to the Chor Elaka, I went with the help of a very lovely NGO, Manav Mukti Shongstha, which is really a local NGO. It wasn't an international NGO, even a national NGO. And so they were very embedded in the context. So I got a certain kind of introduction, but the introduction I got people to tell me what they think a NGO wants to hear, right? So they said, মানব মুক্তি সংস্থা আমাদের জন্য অনেক কিছু করেছে, দেখেন না আমাদের স্কুল আছে, আমাদের গরু দিচ্ছে এটা ওটা, right? So I just listened, right? And I watched the children's perform at the little school, etc. But I kept going back. And every time I got back, it was just like it was like being involved more and hearing more, and also getting caught up in people's lives, right? So I think in those contexts, people tend to forget that
you are from outside,
and you tend to forget because I'm not there embodying my full identity, right? One thing about an anthropologist is that you do actually forget about yourself, your personality, right? You don't sit around missing. I mean, I have children, my children I'm sure hate me, but I forget about having children, right? I forget about having a husband, right? I'm just there, and so I think that kind of being there makes a difference, going back and being there, right? So, and getting involved makes a difference.
So you have stated that you were interested in studying the water and the waterly nature of the land of Bangladesh and etc. So like how did that interest grow inside you? Like why studying water?
This is also is very interestingly shaped by the fieldwork that I did in the context of Pakistan, right? So the research that I did in the context of Pakistan was with very learned people, right? Muftis and people who were religious scholars or people who were seculars fighting them or whatever. So these were people who were in some ways very book oriented, right? And it just became a very bad habit of mine that I started to ask people, "Aap kya padh rahe hain?" Like, what are you reading right now, right? And so that became a way to educate myself on like what people are involved in, right? And so when I showed up in the chore, I started to ask people like, "Apni ki porchen ajkal?"
Oh my God.
And they were like, "Ki porchi mane ki mane ekta boi ache ha amar chele rekhe geche." And so they would pull out this like little book, the school child had left behind. And I realized, oh my God, I'm actually with unlettered people, and my habit is completely wrong, right? However, because I loved doing that, right? And every time I would go from the chore that I was living in to Tangail town, right? The bookstores were amazing. And so I decided that I had to still look at what books that were available in the ecosystem, even if people weren't reading it. And so I just started going into the shops and saying, "Apnader kono local itihash ache kina, itihasher boi ache kina," or because I'm interested in religion, apnader kono dharmik boi ache kina, apnara ki, because I'm also interested in puthi, apnader kono puthi ache kina. Going to local melas also, there are puthis available readily everywhere, right? So I was picking those up. And so as a result, I actually ended up with quite a lot of these books, which were, Palagan and puthi stuff and folk tales and Bhuter Golpo and, local itihash, etc. And so I started reading those, And another thing that I did in the context of Pakistan, which I felt I had to also do here, is that I really engaged a lot in Pakistani, in Urdu literature, right? Because, as a way to improve my Urdu and to have these conversations with various people, I had to do that. And I felt that also because to overcome gaps in my own education and upbringing, I felt that I wanted to also do that in the Bangladeshi context. And so one of the first books that I took up to read was an incredibly hard one, which was Akhtar-uz-Zaman Ilyas's Khwabnama. I mean, I read it in a few months, but then actually to read it took me like
To digest it properly.
Yeah, and it was perfect because it was actually describing people living in haurs and beals, etc. And so it actually spoke very well to my interest in chores. Right?
So regarding knowing about the Khwabnama, were it from like the bookstores of Tangail?
Oh, no. So, yeah, by that time, at some point I wanted to move towards actually looking at the Bengali literature on Nodi, Khal, Bil, Nala. Because of the association with Brahmaputra, Jamuna.
I see.
Yes. In the context of Pakistan, I didn't just go out and just study Urdu literature at large. That would have been too much. I went out and studied things about the neighborhoods I was working in. I was working in Bastis, so I read books about Bastis, right? So I read Intizar Hussein's very famous book on Basti. And then because I was interested in religion and religious history, I read, this very important Urdu author, Mumtaz Mufti, who talks about his sort of reconversion into Islam. And then his effort to his pilgrimage for Hajj, right? And so the same thing was interesting me. I wanted to see what kinds of books were there in the local ecosystem, but I also wanted to see what were the important texts that I should be reading in the Bangladesh context, not in the wider Bengal context, but in the Bangladesh context, at least starting there. Having to do with chores, etc. And so I started with Khwabnama, and then I went on to read his other novel as well, because that also has a big section on one of the characters going to his the village home, which is on a chore, right? So there's a chore element there too. But that was the first novel I took up, and because it was so hard, right? It took so long for me to engage it properly. I decided to do it in collaboration with others. So, with Firdaus Azim as my collaborator, co-editor, we held workshops and panels here in Bangladesh, but also in the context of America, and ultimately did a special issue of a journal, the Journal of Inter-Asian Cultural Studies, a book on the Khwabnama, and it's called The Dreams Navel. Inshallah, it'll be published soon by UPL in this context.
While studying the chores and the people of the chores, how the religious things and the cultural expressions actually encourage the people to grow some sort of a native like expression regarding loving the environment, sort of what we in modern scenario we can say climate resilience, sort of stuff?
That's a very interesting question. So one of the important things that I learned while being in the chore is that the river, right? The river is not a meandering river, right? It actually is a braided river, and that has to do with the slope of the land, the topography of the land. So the river doesn't go like one direction, right? It lots of different paths, and it goes over the land in lots of different ways, right? Some branch of the river is very strong, right? And some branches are very slow and only shows up in the summer months or the monsoon months, etc., right? And so one of the things I realized is that the river is constantly moving, and the people who have to fall into it, like because of erosion, are constantly changing. It's not that the same people experience erosion all the time. It's different people falling into the river. And those are people who have actually lived on what is called Kayam land or mainland or whatever, so on permanent land, Paka land, for a long time, right? So they don't necessarily know what to do when the river comes to them. But what's interesting is they figure it out. How quickly they figure out that you have to build houses like this, or that you have to have this kind of noka, right? Or you have to do this kind of cultivation, right? So there's something about being in the river that teaches you how to live with the river, right? And that was what I was really interested in. A lot of geologists, socio-hydrologists, etc., will say things like, when land breaks and then the land is reconstituted, interestingly, the soil, even though it's a new bunch of soil that's come together, has memory, right? In the sense that the grass, Napier grass, that was grown in an earlier period shows up again in the soil, right?
Automatically.
So, automatically, because it must be carrying seeds. I mean, these are the ways in which it has memory, right? It has soil memory of what is grown before. And so I was theorizing in the book that people have a river memory in them, right? That they fall into the river, and even though they may not have ever had this kind of a relationship with the river, they absorb certain things and know how to behave in the face of a river, right? They don't act helpless. They don't wait for someone to go in and tell them what to do, right? There's no rescue operation here, right? And so I found that really fascinating. Like, how is knowledge transmitted people to people, not generation to generation, people to people across space as the river moves, right? Yeah. And so I would say that that's one of the things that actually marks the population, the people here, is this kind of if this kind of bodily knowledge of how to respond, right? You said something about like religious as well as cultural.
Earlier you were saying about like how the expressions regarding Khaja Khijir, how it has evolved into sort of a developing relations with nature and the people. So
Yes. So what I will say is that, you know, the way that we study songs and we study folk tales, etc., tends to be to culturize it, right? To see it as an expression of people's Bengali culture or the Islamic culture, relationship to the religion, etc., right? I actually think that we should think of them as extensions, like verbal, articulated extensions of bodily memory, right? And they become ways in which knowledge is transmitted across generation, across space, across time, that actually is about this kind of knowledge that I'm talking about, right? So I tend to naturalize them as opposed to culturize them, right? To think that they actually are expressions of how to be or live in a particular environment, right? Not in a functional way, not to say that, you know, they give us ABC lessons, right? It's not like that. It's a little bit more sort of like capturing a sound, right? A sound of thunder, right? Something that is alarming, right? And bringing it into a song, right? And it's serving as a trigger of a memory for somebody else, right? To hear that sound, right? I think that kind of structural analysis is long overdue to be able to see how nature shows up in not just as images, beautiful images already fully formed, but as sounds and animals and movements, etc. All of these things are being captured in language, in poetry, etc. And that's how the communication happens. Should I go back to talking about Kijir?
So some examples.
Okay, so some examples, okay. So I was trying to understand how do I understand climate change, not from environment in, right? Not by looking at like what's happening to the monsoon rains or what's happening to salinization, etc., right? But rather to see where would in living in a completely social setting, right? Where would nature show up, right? One of the things, as I mentioned, is in the way in which cultural stories circulate, right? And one of the biggest figures associated with any Muslim majority society which lives in any proximity to water is Kijir, right? Kijir has shown up in my research in Pakistan, for example, with respect to the river Ravi, which runs through Lahore. And there's so many stories about Kijir there. And one of the figures I study in the context of Pakistan is this poet, Muhammad Iqbal, who you may know. He has a poem on Kijir, which is all about water, right? And so, you know, and you'll see in different parts of the world, there's a Kijir, right? So this is one of the connecting threads.
Maybe in a different name or like in different expression.
In different expression, right? But the word Kijir is actually quite stable. It shows up as Kijir, although it will have other names as well. But some way or other you'll hear the word Kijir, right? Kidir, Kijir, you know, Kijir, you know, all of this, but it'll still have that particular formation. So one of the things that I noticed over the course of doing field work is that when you talk to women, they don't remember Kijir, right? But they will talk about all these ghostly things, scary things that are like fish-like, right? That they feel prey on humans, you know? And particularly women who are in the fisherman community, right? People, it's so interesting, like in the village that I worked in, if you went from the center of the village to the riverside, the stories changed, right? So they will talk about Masdao, right? Which is actually this pretty scary thing, which is about wanting fish, right?
It is popular as Pichash.
As well, right? So that was pretty interesting. No Kijir, but you know, but they were telling me this. Older women will say, no, there was Bera Bhashan, right? And Bhashaner Shamay, we used to have a kijir, right?
see.
And so there was a ritual of like taking a kolapata, right, and just bhashafying it, and then putting on it all these objects, right, to put out to sea. And you know, the scholars who've studied this say that this goes back to the 13th century, right, Bira Bhashan, especially in the Bengal, wider Bengal region, right? But then when you talk to people men, right, and religious men, right, they don't tell you these stories of kijir. They don't tell you anything that has to do with water, right? They tell you about kijir in terms of young people wanting to discover, to be closer to God, leaving their homes, and kijir showing them the way.
Ooh.
Right? Kijir being the man in green, showing up and saying, "Ei pot dore." Right? And so I decided to study this in two ways. One way was through gender, right? And an occupation. So fishermen, women versus men, religious market, right? But then the other way was to actually look at it in terms of the transformation from water to land, right? And I made this speculation in one of my papers that this is one of the ways we might think about how Bangladesh is becoming a drier country, right?
So the
Because
stories of
stories
Khijirs are getting
changing.
lost.
Yeah, not lost, but they're changing into
evolving.
something different, right? Showing a dry orientation towards a drier context.
So regarding studying the chores of Bangladesh, you have said that you have seen some sort of a gendered perspective. While studying the Islam of Pakistan, were there also the gendered perspective present? Like, were you interviewing some women also there?
Such a good question, because this is one of the things that, I realized halfway through my research that I was doing an incredibly male project, right? I was going into masjids and I was talking to imams and I was talking to, mosque committee members who were largely all men in neighborhoods in Lahore, right? And I don't know why that happened. I think initially just a very practical reason is that I went in wanting to study architecture, right? The architecture of mosques. But because most of the mosques were involved in sort of battles, internal battles, or some sort of tensions, internal tension, I ended up studying that part of mosques as opposed to the architecture.
In all the mosques of Pakistan, they would have to register them into a certain school of thought. Also, like they would have to declare that I am from Berelvi or I am from Deobandi community.
Absolutely. But then, the neighborhood matters, and sometimes they register as Berelvi, but then Deobandis will start praying there, and so there'll be a shift in the culture of the mosque, right? Or vice versa, right? So these sorts of things are always happening and it reflects, the changing population of the neighborhood as well. And so at some point, I decided to pivot a little bit more to paying attention to, bringing in a gender perspective. But I didn't do that by going to, there were no women-only mosques, right? There were women sections of mosques, but very few women went, except for those who belonged to Ahle Hadith. Right?
Yeah.
Rafaiddin, as they're called here. And I didn't want to go out and seek them like that. I wanted it to be a bit more organic. So what I decided to do is to look the mosques that I had chosen. I started to get to know the neighborhoods better, right? To try and understand what were the relationship between homes and the mosques, right? How were what the imam was saying affecting the women in the houses. I also started to follow the women associated with the imams I was looking at, right? And so in this way, I started to look at the realm of the domestic, right, and to try and get somewhat more the concept, the gendered perspective on Islam in the context of Pakistan.
So what was it like?
So what I found was it was very nuanced, right? So for instance, there was a woman who I talk about in the book that I wrote called Muslim Becoming. There's a baji, a woman who's really an older person who holds like school in her house for the girls in the neighborhood to come do their religious education. teacher.
So it is like a madrasa.
It's not a madrasa. There are proper madrasas for girls, lots of madrasas for girls. This is more sort of like Quran Shikha.
Semi-formal.
Semi-formal,
religious education.
yeah, but it's quite serious. Like you can actually get all the way to,
Becoming a Hafid.
yeah, there, right? As well as they get their regular education there too. This is like a tuition place as well. If they don't want to go to school because school is taking a lot of time, they have housework, so they come here and they study for their exams as well. So it was a very interesting kind of a space. And this woman, I thought that, she would be very tough as a teacher, very pious, etc. Because her husband is Ahle Hadith, and he was quite hardcore. And she said things like, women don't have the capacity for such certainty, right? Which was a very interesting statement because it made it seem like women are weak, right? But actually what she was also saying is that certainty in all cases.
That's also expressing the fluidity of women.
Yes, exactly. So I thought it was a beautiful thing, what she was saying. It was such a deep way she was saying it because I asked her lots of different questions about it. So in this way, I thought it was really interesting. Like in some instances, women supported the men in terms of their struggles that they were in. In some instances, women just said, that's for men to do. I don't have time to waste on that. And they just went on with their own things, So I found women's relationship to orthodoxy or to, because what Talal Asad says is that the people who look religious are not necessarily the seat of the orthodoxy. Orthodoxy is whenever there's an assertion that this is the right way.
That's the right way.
Yes, that authoritative bid. Right.
That would be the Islam with capital I.
Yes, so that's orthodoxy. So taking that to be orthodoxy, I saw that women's, not all, but it was very nuanced. They felt a sort of a discomfort with certainty. They didn't have discomfort with some of the regulations or behavior or the being asked to be within the domestic realm, etc. But they had difficulty with the certainty. They just felt that they needed to be more flexible because they had children who were doing wrong things, or they saw family members who were not perfect, etc. They themselves were not perfect. So I think that there was a lot more nuance in the way that women were expressing their religiosity, right? At least in the cases that I studied. There are people who have studied the madrasas, the study circles, and that's another sort of space where it might require a different performance of religiosity,
While studying the women of Ahle Hadith community, like you have highlighted the story of that Baji, was it different, the concept of fluidity, was it different in the women of other communities? Is it a community-based sort of experience, or it is sort of a global experience of women being more fluid toward religiosity?
No, I would never universalize women. Women, there are all sorts of women, we had a certain women leader in the context of Pakistan.
Were rigid women also present,
Yes, of course. The very, very, hardcore women. So, and not just hardcore about religion, but hardcore about politics, etc. Right? So there's a whole variety. All I'm saying is that I think that in the context of Pakistan, speaking about mosques and the sort of practices around mosques, that was a very male space, right? And but women were also religious. They were religious either, going in to say their prayers in the area of the mosque or in their houses, or the ways that they did Quran, Shikha, etc. There were many ways they were expressing their religiosity, but they didn't always espouse the kinds of certainties that a public sphere kind of Islam did.
Getting into more of an academic perspective, you are an anthropologist, so what's the process like for you? You were studying the stories, you were hearing it, and then just you have come up with some perspective, just you have shared that a woman who is much more fluid toward the religious tradition, or who is much more welcoming, accommodating. So what's about that aha moment? How do you come up with that quote, the amazing quote, which actually breaks down all the perspectives? So what's that eureka moment for you? Like?
Yeah, no, this is a good question because it's actually a methodological question, and it's asking about two things, which is one, because you have to be doing field work for a long period of time, you have to be gathering data for a long period of time. Are your perspectives based on that long-term study, or is your perspective sort of based on a moment when something clicks?
When you are doing through a long-term study, you are getting many observations, like there is a chance of getting lost into the alibis, into the stories. Like, what's the process of getting that exact moment, the exact story you want to hear? Like,
that's such a good question, because it's the question of when an anthropologist knows that they have something like a sense of what the society is like, right? And I think one of the ways in which an anthropologist can tell is when they can get a joke, right? And another moment that they can tell that they really fit in is when they can tell a joke, because it's very hard to tell a joke, right? It's easier to get a joke, but that too takes a long time to get a joke, right? You can't just get a joke by being in a society for a short period of time. You have to really understand a lot about what winking looks like there, right? So that's cultural knowledge that you have to have.
ma'am, is it like more of an intuitive thing, or like you are trained as an anthropologist in universities?
I think you have to be trained. I mean, you have to be trained to pay attention, right? It's not a method about questionnaire, etc. It's about paying attention. And it's also about describing.
I have also taken some courses on cultural anthropology and anthropology. Like in Bangladesh, when we study anthropology, we just go through like what is anthropology, how the different case studies are being presented. Like, but how that training actually takes place in terms of like foreign countries or like better universities, or like how you have gone through the training process of like observing. Like, was it sort of a lab work or like field work? Like how that you are being trained?
So, for example, I'll just give you the example of the class I'm teaching right now, which is called Methods, right? And we don't teach methods before people go to do the field.
Oh, so firstly they will be going to field and then they will getting the
Yes. And so there's that, right? What does that mean? It means that not everybody uses the same methods, right? You go to the field, you try to survive there, right? For however long, we usually ask somebody to go for 6 weeks, right? The summer before the class. Then they come back and they tell us what they've done, right? And then I give them lots and lots of little exercises, right? I ask them, today please write 2 pages on an object that you paid a lot of attention to. Not a person, but an object, right? Another day I'll say, describe a moment when somebody recognized you. Right? Okay, so like this, they do 10 exercises or more or less or whatever, small pieces where they have to describe something, they have to describe an object, they have to describe themselves in the field, etc. And then as they write, right, as they're presenting their field work to me, they're processing all the sensory data that they captured and that they wrote in their field notes. And by the end, they have a sense of what methods they actually need for their project. Right?
I see.
We don't teach them the methods and then go out and have them do the research with those methods. We have them experience what they want to experience and then process that experience so that then they know what their question is and what method that question requires.
So every student develop his or her own method.
Yes.
Wow.
Yes. So I've had 2 students this year. One of them is Korean, but working in Japan and working with a particular minority there, indigenous minority there. And he did field work, right? And he came just describing all of these things. And at the end, he realized that his prior training as a social worker was influencing all the questions he was asking, right? So going forward, he's going to pay very much attention to the questions he asks, right? The second person, she was coming from India and she is of Naga background, right? And she went to the museum to study a museum in London, in Oxford, right? And through looking at her interactions with objects, just objects, not even people, looking at the tags, right? She realized that there's all this intertribal politics under the category of Naga, and that she's Liang Mai, and that she should really study what it is to be Liang Mai. Right, but only through looking at all these objects,
yeah.
right, and describing her interactions with the objects and the tags and the curators and the history of the object did she come to this, right? So both of them came to very important realizations just by dissecting the experience that they had.
So like studying anthropology is also studying yourself, like how you perceive the society.
Yes, because the most important thing about an anthropologist is that you're the tool, right? This is actually an observation made by a German thinker very long time ago, Goethe, right? Where he writes about how, he's writing something on light. And people don't understand it because Newton is writing about light at the same time, and his writing doesn't make any sense, right? Because Newton has given us laws, right? And his writing is about like weird things. Like, for example, if you stare at a light for a long time and you close your eyes, you see the red star, the red light. He was studying that, right? So it was a phenomena. It had nothing to do with the actual light. And so he was asked to give an explanation of his method, and he said, I'm not studying light objectively like Newton is. I'm studying light as it affects the human. Right? And so, this also is a phenomenon that requires close observation, right? And can be given a systematic account. And so I just thought that was so wonderful when I was reading it. I just thought I should mention it. But anyway, but the point is that the most important thing for an anthropologist is to really learn to understand your responses as important to analyze.
So ma'am, regarding like studying anthropology, the young scholar who are thinking of moving into anthropology especially, like who should get into it and who should not get into it? Like what's the green flags and the red flags?
So, I mean, I just remember when I was getting my PhD, my mother saying, "Porashona ki shesh hobe na, ar koto din," right? I mean, if you feel that you want to get on with your life, right? You want to, have a family, have children, get some real money, one day own a car or a house or whatever you want to do, then academia is not for you, right? Academia is for the person who's bitten by a question, right? And just wants to scratch at that question, And academia is just a formal way to be able to do that, right? But you have to be able to just commit yourself to just following your curiosity, right? And not having to always justify it or explain it or give functional reasons for it. You have to get money to be able to do the field work, but to deep down know that you're really doing it for yourself and for knowledge, for the production of knowledge. So I think if you have patience, and you're happy to just stay for a long time looking at some phenomenon, then academia is for you. It doesn't matter whether it's anthropology. It could be physics. My husband's a physicist. He has the same personality, so...
So, ma'am, you are saying that the patience is the key.
And love for the
So, what would be the...
red flag? I think it's the person... I mean, I'll give you a personal example. So I have a daughter. She's very smart, and I hope she never sees this. So she wants to study biology. She's gotten into a PhD program, and she's interested in vaccine development, all very important, right? But her heart is sinking because 7 years of her life is going to go towards the PhD, right? And she's working right now before she starts. And what I've tried to tell her is that if her heart is not settled, right, she shouldn't do it. Just because she needs it to do vaccine development doesn't mean she has that's for her, right? She should find another way to be involved in vaccine development. Vaccine development takes hundreds of people, right? It's a whole village, right, that has to grow around a vaccine. So she just has to figure out what her passion is and to follow it. The fact that she's starting off with a sinking heart at the thought of 7 years of university means that this may not be for her.
Less chance of developing interest later on.
Yes, and she might take it as, I mean, she'll do it, she'll get a PhD, she's a very, very determined soul, right? But I'm not sure that academia is for her. She already knows that, she doesn't want to be an academic, but I'm not even sure that the PhD is for her, right? So...
when new students are trying to get into social sciences, and we are seeing that globally the perspective towards social science is changing, the funds are being cut and all these things are happening. So how do you see all overall this phenomena? Like students are interested, but their scopes are getting limited a little bit.
Yes. No, and the sad thing is that the United States, the university model there is based on the German model, and the German model is all about creating the whole person, right? It's Bildung, the person's self-development. And America had really espoused that ethos for a long time. All these universities, the reason why America is a beacon for the world is because they really developed the person so that your chances of success were very high, because you actually knew yourself, so you could apply yourself very well in whatever field, etc., you were doing. However, that commitment went very quickly, right? And one of the reasons why that commitment had held for so long was the feeling that, in Germany what happened, which is Nazism, that could have been prevented if that humanities had stayed alive, or not so much social sciences, but the humanities, right? Because it asked the big questions, like, is this good for humanity? What is a good life? And what is a human, etc.? And so that question, those questions of what humanity gives, was seen to be a very important bulwark against reactionary thinking, right? But again, Germany came up with the university model and Germany succumbed, right? And so in the US, it's the same. The university espoused the German model, and the US has also given up very quickly on humanities and social sciences, right? Because they feel like they're in a competition with China and so on around technological innovation. They don't want to be left behind, and limited resources, cost-benefit analysis, something has to go. But, this is what has failed, in the model, is to think how intrinsic is this that it should be there in addition to, right? And I don't know what to say. I mean, the situation now is that there's such a reaction against the humanities and social sciences. And now it's not even in terms of economic competition, it's an ideological reaction.
Exactly, sort of.
Yeah, so, universities are seen as woke, and, they seem to have perpetuated all this liberal, attitudes that the majority in the right, etc., would like to see it reversed, etc. So it's under so much attack that that I think people can well expect that the funds have shrunk. If they haven't, they are definitely going to shrink even further, even maybe disappear. But every once in a while you meet like an older anthropologist, and the older anthropologist complains that the younger anthropologists, like myself, etc., grew up in very cushy times, right? Where there were funds, and we just assumed that we had.
So previously there was
no funds. That they put their money. They went as Peace Corps. They went, to teach English abroad and did their work.
So anthropology was the side hustle.
Very much of a side hustle.
See.
And so they just think that, our memory is so short that we just think that we are entitled to all this money and support and recognition, etc. But that anthropology, early anthropology, the really problematic anthropology, was done by colonial officers, right? But then the next generation of anthropologists was self-funded, right?
Wow.
And some, so it was just like you realize that, and you realize that if people are committed, they'll find ways to continue to ask the question and to do the research, right? And actually, if you look at a lot of poets and novelists, etc., they have day jobs.
They are doing it by themselves, so not getting funded by
Yes,
anybody.
exactly. And Akhtaruzzamан Ilyas is really interesting because he did a ton of research to write Khwabnama, right? And in one of his interviews, he says that sociologists of the future will thank me for the research I did, and that went into the book. The book is a novel, but it is a sociological novel, right?
So it was quite a deep reflection.
Yes, and so, if an author can do this as part of writing a novel, anthropologists should be able to do this as part of living their lives,
So, ma'am, developing from that question, earlier I have asked, like when we are seeing a new phenomena, which is quite growing, that people from Bangladesh are getting into abroad for studying social sciences, like how this whole phenomena is contributing to the global knowledge production, and is Bangladesh is making some new way or new area in the global landscape of knowledge production through this sort of tendencies of people getting into foreign lands, studying there, or like even teaching there. So what's your perspective on it, the whole phenomena?
Yeah, so in the context of in America, the country that's held a lot of dominance in terms of knowledge production, both about itself but also in terms of contributing to wider fields, is, I'm talking about humanities and social sciences, right? I'm not talking about the natural sciences, where there are many, many South Asians, right? Is India, right? And so a little bit breaking the dominance, the hegemony of India in the South Asia Studies Department has been an effort. And the reason why India has been hegemonic is not only because of India, it's because of American security concerns, right? Geopolitics, all these programs that you have in...
So they have mostly taken Indian students.
They haven't just taken Indian students, they've taken India as representative of the region of South Asia, right? And it has to do with the same way as China has been taken as representative of East Asia, of that area.
Was there even representation of India, or like even certain caste from India exclusively, or like certain class?
I think that it took a while for Indians to even break into the study of India, right? Because the study of India was being done by scholars who were coming to India, but then work, from the West, right? And so Indians going into this was already the first move. And so now the next set of moves has been to try and make significant the study of the other parts, like Sri Lanka went next, then I would say Pakistan, and now a little bit Bangladesh is coming up, etc. It's the same way in the study of China, for instance. You had China, then you had the focus on Japan, and slowly the focus on Korea, right, is coming
Thailand,
in.
And then
So you see, so it takes a while for the, because it came out of a geopolitical interest of US to understand more about those parts of the world. They funded these centers. So these centers were very much oriented towards whatever was strategic, right? And later they became more academic. And then the question of representation, a better representation of the region came up. But even so, Bangladesh is still underrepresented. There are fantastic, historians now and anthropologists, political scientists, etc. But I think that something like a Bangladesh model or a contribution to the field is not there in the way, for example, India gave subaltern studies, right? So
we are keeping our fingers crossed and hoping that someday.
Yes, no, and I think that we don't have to worry about that. It's not, the importance is not to be oriented about like are we recognized, etc. It's to just continue to do really good work in the country and to encourage good work in the country, because eventually the quality of work just sort of speaks for itself, like that happened in the context of Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka didn't care too much that they weren't represented in these areas. They just really invested in social sciences and humanities in their own institutions, and you really see an efflorescence of like, a Sri Lankan sort of like orientation towards anthropology. right? So, which is quite strong. Anthropology in Sri Lanka is quite strong.
Quite interesting anecdotes overall from your life, your works, and your perceptions towards society. So, ma'am, wrapping it all up, like you have done quite works on Bangladesh, and you are now also doing your work on July, and you are closely observing the youth of Bangladesh. Like, so what's your perspective on the possibilities in the youth? Like, how do you see Bangladesh and the youth of Bangladesh in next 15 years or like even in 50 years? So what's your take on it?
Yeah, so I mean, what I've been really impressed by amongst the young people I've been meeting is just how hard they work, right? I mean, they have to work, and I don't mean in their studies, right? I mean in many fronts, right? So they, lots of university students, for instance, they're in school, but they also have a part-time job. They're also doing quite a lot of family care, right? They're also trying to be involved in cultural activities and trying to also produce cultural products and so on. And so I think that there's a lot of energy there. I think that, the problem has been for so long that the education, the real education in the classrooms was not there. It moved on to like study circles and these independent efforts, right? I think what we need to do is actually get people back into classes. I do, because I think that you can't just self-educate, right? Like as you just heard, my working with the two students, it's a very
rigorous process,
very
and
rigorous,
formal process.
yeah, very formal process. And so this kind of self-examination, the ability to do well, to study something well, to read something well, it's not about getting a lot, it's about learning how to really go deep. And I think that is getting a bit lost. And so I wonder if we can find good, encouraging, healthy contexts in which people can start to reinvest in that. Because I think a lot of the doing a lot is to make sure that they have some good outcomes, job prospects or teaching ability, etc., given the political situation, financial conditions, etc. So I think if we can figure out what the classroom can be again and to really reinvest. I mean, I think that private universities are starting to do that, but that's a very problematic structure, right? Because that's the kind of
not that much welcoming and accommodating towards all the classes.
Yes, not that, and brain drain within the country from institution to institution, so I think that has a certain parasitical quality too. And so if there can be something like a joint collaboration, but not at the level of institution, administration, etc., but at the level of students and faculty, I think that would be good. While funds are not there, to try and figure out how to have these lateral relations.
How do you see yourself? Like you were interested firstly in Pakistan's Islam, then moving on to the chores of Bangladesh, and then July. Do you see many more stories in Bangladesh? Like you think you should deep dive into, or like other anthropologists or social scientists should look into it? Any stories or any particular incidents?
In the context of Bangladesh?
Yeah.
I think Bangladesh is rich in stories. I think it's it's a part of the wider Bengal. There's that story. Then the fact that it's oriented towards the ocean, that's another story. The fact that it belongs in the global context through this framework of climate change is another story. So I think Bangladesh is participating in lots of contexts and has a lot of internal depth to it. I think that if we can get the people who are, because Bangladeshis are actually by nature quite observant, right? It's something that I didn't see in the context of Pakistan. In the context of Pakistan, I found people were kind of blind to their environment. There wasn't that much curiosity about their context. Whereas in the context of Bangladesh, if you get people talking, they'll describe in detail, right? Like what their, gram is like, right? And things like that. So I think if we can get people to actually put those stories down, to have them more available, to have them in film context, etc. I think we might start to see a little bit more sort of like, togetherness. I don't see unity, and I don't see, because class divisions are quite entrenched here, but a little bit more fellow sympathy, I didn't answer your question.
Ma'am, yeah, I have got some anecdotes that are quite interesting. So the last question,
Yeah.
like, ma'am, we are seeing some revolutionary shift in the landscape of academia. Like, we have seen how the big data thing and also the large language model thing has came up, and like how the whole landscape is shifting. So what's your take on it? Like, is the ethnographic study the future of academia, like when it is always studied on a subjective perspective, on like how this sort of large language model and AI will be affecting the writing habit and all the academia things?
Yeah, so this is a great question, because, something that comes to be developed in the West, really, when it circulates elsewhere, develops a whole different other life and becomes all these different nuances. For example, social media, right? Facebook, in the context of America, has been a source of tremendous polarization of society, right? Whereas Facebook, in the context of Bangladesh, has been a source of tremendous political mobilization, right? And not just Facebook, all the other sort of platforms and apps, etc. So a new kind of potential came into being, right, through the way it was mobilized here at a time when Facebook was totally waning in importance in the context of the US, right? So I'm curious to see how large language models are taken up in this context, right? I can see how it would be in some ways kind of flattening of the playing field, because you now have access to information in a way that you didn't when you have libraries that have paywalls, etc., etc. So information flowing in that way could be incredibly, for instance, from my childhood, from the information that was available to me through like books of Britannica versus my children and the sources of knowledge they have, they just start off smarter, right? So I think large language models has the potential to just sort of like even the playing field a bit and give access to a lot of information and knowledge, right? But the problem that we're finding in the US context is that it's really preventing people from doing the hard work of reading, writing, because that has developmental effects on the brain, right? And so people aren't able to make connections as well, right? Children who are exposed to large language models have actual problems of not just comprehending, but of analyzing. Right? And so the questions will be, how will that be dealt with in this context? Like, what kinds of skills will it erode? Right? Maybe access to our own memories, right, will be eroded, right? So things like that, I will be curious to see both how it plays a good role, but also I'm worried about what that means for the younger generation as they develop, because the people like yourself, you grew up reading and writing with pencil, etc. And so now when you take it up, it just builds on what already you did. But if you started at that level, at a younger level,
that would be very much dangerous.
Yeah, so I don't know if it's dangerous or not. I just don't know what it would compromise for our children in this country.
Just thinking about it, jotting it down, and then the whole write-up paper will be coming up.
It will be coming up, right? So I think that these are all being explored in the academic context. And so, but I think for right now, I think it's a positive thing for a place like Bangladesh, right? And I think it can I think it can help a lot, boost things, get people.
Evening up the whole field.
Yeah, I think, yeah.
So yeah, ma'am, we have gone through many issues, many questions, and we have seen many perspectives from you. So it was quite an interesting podcast. I hope you have also enjoyed the podcast. So yeah, thank you so much, ma'am, for joining in.
And thank you for those wonderful questions. I really got to like explore the whole world of, of thought. So thank you.
So thanks to the audience for joining into the Fine Line podcast. Thank you all.